The private dining suite on the 49th floor had its own microclimate, cooler than the rest of the tower, deliberately chilled to force people to stay alert. The air smelled faintly of oud and polished silver. Every employee who entered it did so with lowered eyes and careful breaths, as if even oxygen belonged to him. Tonight it was silent. Not the comfortable silence of wealth, but the taut, suspended kind that bruises the atmosphere. At the head of the obsidian table sat Sheikh Khalid al-Rashad, a man whose presence was so controlled it felt engineered. Every movement had weight. Even the way he held the Mont Blanc pen between two fingers radiated the same message he always delivered without speaking. You exist because I allow it. To his left, a stack of documents, the rumored 300 Nautilus acquisition contract. To his right, an empty crystal glass waiting to be filled before the signatures began. The staff waited at the wall in perfect formation. Not a shoe scuffed, not a breath audible. Their fear was quiet, disciplined, practiced. Then she walked in. Mara Solis, new hire, poorly fitted vest, hair tied back too tightly and eyes too observant for the room she'd been placed in. She carried the carafe with both hands, steady but intentional, as if she had rehearsed the act of not trembling. The others watched her with a kind of doomed pity. No one survived their first week in this room without being broken down. Not a single server had ever answered him back. Not once. But the moment she stepped beside him, the sheikh lifted his gaze, cold, appraising, already ready to dismiss. And something in her posture did not fold. She belonged nowhere here. And yet, somehow, she did not shrink. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. Mara felt the weight of every stare the moment she stepped back toward the service line. The senior staff avoided looking at her directly. Avoiding eye contact was the first rule of survival on this floor. But she could sense their internal recoil, that silent, "What are you doing?" echoing beneath their disciplined stillness. She kept her hands clasped behind her back, a posture she learned from watching people in authority rather than serving them. Her breathing was controlled, almost measured, the way she used to breathe before oral examinations, back when her life still had a plan. The sheikh summoned her without words, a subtle tilt of the glass. His gestures were sharp, all angles and precision, never needing volume. His clipped Gulf dialect slid across the table, low and dismissive, as he spoke to his advisor about her. It wasn't the content, it was the intention. A commentary on incompetent hires, a remark about her shaky hands, a note that she looked like she did not belong in a building this expensive. He did not lower his voice. He never did. No one ever answered. Mara's jaw tightened, but she moved forward, picked up the glass, and filled it with a steady pour. Not a drop spilled. She placed it down gently, exactly 1 inch from his pen, exactly where he expected it. Then he made the mistake of assuming she did not understand him. He spoke again in that clipped dialect, an insult this time, something about her being decorative at best. The room froze. Something inside her, small, compressed, carved by debts and nights spent translating texts in a hostile basement, lifted its head. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change expression. But she answered him in flawless classical Arabic. The sound landed like a blade carefully laid on polished stone. Clean, precise, impossible to ignore. Every server stiffened. His advisors stopped breathing. Even the sheikh himself paused. A micro-pause, the kind that reveals a crack in a monolith. Her pronunciation was not only perfect, it was educated. It was the Arabic of manuscripts and courts, of scholars, not staff. For the first time in years, someone inside this room had matched him in the one domain he believed untouchable: language. He leaned back slowly, studying her with a new, uneasy attention. Not respect, yet, but the early shape of something he did not like: uncertainty. But Mara didn't waver. She bowed her head with the quiet precision of someone who had learned dignity the hard way and stepped back into position. No one spoke for several long seconds. In silence, the room discovered a truth older than any contract. Power becomes fragile the moment it is questioned by someone who has nothing left to lose. Mara kept her eyes fixed on the far wall, staring at the faint reflection of the room in the dark glass. In that ghost-like mirror, she looked like a shadow. Thin, tired, almost translucent. Exactly how she felt most days. She had spent the past 6 years trying not to be seen. It began with the fellowship she lost after her mother's medical debt swallowed her savings. Continents moved, visas expired. The pressure of unpayable loans wrapped around her ribs until breathing itself felt expensive. Every morning she reminded herself she wasn't supposed to be here. Not serving a billionaire, not speaking in classical Arabic, not standing in a room where glass coasters cost more than her monthly rent. She worked nights. She translated obscure fragments of medieval texts for private collectors who underpaid her. She slept in a room without windows. She kept her brilliance quiet because brilliance didn't guarantee safety. And the quieter she became, the more invisible she felt. The other servers thought she was fragile. No voice, no confidence, small steps, small presence. But they didn't see the nights she sat under fluorescent hostel lights, annotating manuscripts for people who would never remember her name. They didn't know she once dreamed of becoming a philologist, until life taught her that dreams were luxuries. She had promised herself one thing: do not draw attention. Not here. The tower was hostile, its wealth sharp enough to cut. The sheikh, especially, valued silence around him the way others valued air. But a humiliation spoken in a dialect he assumed she did not understand had cracked her caution in two. Now every employee in the room watched her differently, not with admiration, but with dread. They knew what happened to those who crossed him. People were reassigned, contracts abruptly ended, lives quietly rearranged. No one challenged the man signing a $300 deal. Not a server, not an immigrant woman with no safety net. Her fingers trembled slightly behind her back. Just slightly, the tremor of adrenaline after confrontation. But she kept her posture trained and still. She reminded herself, you needed this job. You needed the paycheck. You needed to not vanish again. But something irreversible had already happened. By speaking, she had made herself visible. And visibility, she knew too well, came with consequences. A universal truth whispered through her mind, steadying her breathing. Sometimes the smallest act of defiance breaks the lock on a life you were never meant to stay trapped in. The maître d', pale and tight-lipped, approached Mara the moment she stepped back into the service line. His whisper sharp, rehearsed, terrified. "You will stay for the presentation," he murmured. "No rotations tonight." Her stomach dropped. Presentations in this room were closed-door rituals. Only senior staff remained. New hires were always sent out before the doors sealed. It protected them from the volatile mix of money, ego, and pressure that came with the sheikh's major acquisitions. But Mara understood immediately. This wasn't a privilege, it was containment. The sheikh wanted her where he could see her. The staff exchanged glances, tiny, furtive flashes of pity. They knew the rule. If he singled you out, even in silence, your employment hung by a thread thinner than a signature line. The heavy doors slid shut with a soft hydraulic hiss, trapping 12 people inside the suite. The outside world disappeared behind acoustic insulation and privacy seals. The temperature lowered by 2 degrees, on purpose. It made people more compliant, the consultants often joked. The sheikh leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that blended curiosity with warning. The insult she'd returned to him still hovered in the room, like static. At the center of the table, a projector lit up, illuminating the object of tonight's acquisition. A centuries-old manuscript claimed to be a lost Andalusian treatise on water rights and early hydraulic engineering. A priceless artifact, if real. A financial catastrophe, if not. 3 experts from the seller's side stood ready to present, suits immaculate, watches heavy. Their confidence performed rather than lived. Mara moved to the back wall, folding her hands, forcing her breath to slow. She told herself she wouldn't speak again. Not a word. She just needed to survive this night. The lead expert began describing the manuscript's provenance, his voice polished and authoritative. Pages flashed across the screen, vellum browned with age, geometric diagrams, intricate marginal notes. The sheikh listened with cool, calculated patience. His advisors scribbled discreet notes. The seller's representatives maintained the relaxed arrogance of people certain of victory. But the entire room kept an unblinking eye on Mara, because she was the variable no one understood, and one unpredictable variable in a room where everything was controlled could be dangerous. She studied the images from afar, pretending not to care, pretending not to know exactly what she was looking at. Her mind, however, moved with a speed she hadn't allowed it in years, an old part of herself waking up. She had promised she wouldn't get involved, but the manuscript on the screen held a question in its ink. And questions, for her, were always louder than fear. Some truths pull you forward, even when you want to disappear. The presentation unfurled with the polished confidence of men who expected applause. Slides shifted from macro photographs to lineage charts, then to stamped certificates of authenticity. The seller's experts spoke in coordinated rhythm, one detailing the manuscript's unbroken custodial chain, another praising the rare geometric precision of its hydraulic diagrams, a third stressing the impossible-to-fake marginalia. Every claim was delivered like a verdict. The sheikh listened with his characteristic stillness, a stillness that made even truth feel intimidated. His advisors nodded at the right moments. The air pulsed with the kind of certainty that comes right before a signature worth hundreds of millions. But Mara felt the first faint ripple of something wrong. It was not a mistake she saw, yet. More like a wrong note in a familiar melody. A discomfort she recognized in her bones, the same way she used to sense inconsistencies in manuscripts during her academic years before she abandoned that world. She stood at perfect attention, hands behind her back, expression neutral, but her mind was leaning toward the screen, mapping details, stitching fragments. A vellum sheet flashed. Another. Then, there. For a fraction of a second, a discrepancy so small, most eyes would have never registered it. Her breath caught. Not visibly, not audibly, just a tiny tightening of her ribs. The ink in one marginal note had a density she didn't like. Too saturated, too controlled. Ancient ink bled differently. It frayed microscopically, feathered with time. But this line was firm. Young. Overconfident. She blinked once, grounding herself. No, don't do this. Stay out of it. But the next slide appeared, and the discomfort deepened. The ruling lines beneath the script, those faint grooves scribes carved to guide neat handwriting, were too straight, almost mechanically consistent. Medieval ruling was precise, yes, but not machine perfect. Her pulse quickened. Another slide. Another fraction of a clue. A geometric diagram showed an angle notation style that didn't belong to the manuscript's supposed century. Subtle, but off. Like hearing a single modern note in a medieval chant. She swallowed. One detail could be chance. 2 could be coincidence. 3 meant trouble. Across the long table, the sheikh's gaze flicked toward her, noticing the shift in her posture, the faint tension in her shoulders. She lowered her eyes immediately. The sellers continued, confident, oblivious. They presented the manuscript's supposed journey through private estates, monasteries, climate-controlled vaults. Every slide strengthened their case. Every claim tightened the noose around a 300 Naruto's decision. But Mara's discomfort had become a quiet, growing certainty. Something in that manuscript did not belong to the century it claimed to come from. And if she was right, this room was about to witness a financial catastrophe dressed up as history. Sometimes the smallest details whisper the loudest warnings. By the time the presentation reached its final segment, the tone in the room had shifted from confidence to inevitability. The sellers moved with the assurance of men who believed the deal was already sealed. Their smiles were controlled, their explanations polished, their gestures wide enough to signal authority without appearing theatrical. On the screen, the manuscript rotated in a 3D scan, each illuminated page casting soft reflections across the sheikh's expressionless face. The lead expert clasped his hands behind his back, stepping forward as if stepping into a spotlight. "What you see here," he declared, "is one of the most complete hydraulic treatises from the Andalusian Golden Age. No forgery in the last century has even approached this level of accuracy." His voice had the cadence of a closing argument. A second expert chimed in, reassuring the sheikh that the vellum had passed spectral analysis. A third reiterated the uniqueness of the marginal annotations. "Absolutely period correct," he said, tapping the pointer for emphasis. Every sentence worked like a weight pressing the room toward compliance. Mara felt the tension rising not only in her own body, but in the bodies of the staff around her. The servers were rigid, the advisors were attentive. The sheikh remained still, but his stillness felt like a fuse waiting for flame. When the final slide appeared, authenticity confirmed by 5 independent laboratories, the sellers stepped back with the ceremonial poise of men who had already spent the commission in their minds. The sheikh gave a single nod. The contract was placed in front of him. A pen was set beside it. The advisors leaned in. The sellers straightened their suits. A quiet victory exhaled across their posture. The maitre d' glanced at Mara from the corner of his eye, as if silently begging her not to interfere with anything that might jeopardize the room's balance. She tried to steady herself. She really did. But her mind kept circling back to the anomalies she had seen. Each one small, each one explainable in isolation. Yet together, they formed a pattern she recognized intimately. The pattern of a forgery, crafted by someone who understood just enough about medieval methods to mimic them, but not enough to escape a philologist's eye. The ruling lines were wrong. The ink density was wrong. The angle notation was centuries too modern. The closer the sheikh's fingers moved toward the pen, the louder her internal warning became. Her heart thudded once against her ribs, a physical knock from the truth inside her. This manuscript was not perfect. It was too perfect. A forgery designed to seduce wealthy collectors. A forgery tailored exactly to men like the sheikh, men who valued rarity, prestige, legacy. Her breath held, suspended with the room. No one here expected her to speak again. No one believed she would dare. But truth doesn't stop existing just because silence is safer. Perfection is often the first sign that something is wrong. The sheikh's fingers hovered over the pen, the metal glinting under the recessed ceiling light. That glint sliced across the room like a countdown. Every advisor straightened. Every seller leaned forward. Every staff member held still, trained to silence the way soldiers are trained to march. Mara felt the shift in temperature, how the room seemed to cool another degree, how the air tightened as if preparing for a theatrical moment of wealth and inevitability. She could almost hear the imagined headlines, already written in someone's mind. Sheikh Khalid acquires. Lost Andalusian masterpiece for 300 nahtars. The pen was inches from paper. Her pulse drummed. loud enough that it felt like the room should hear it. She forced herself to stand straight. She told herself, "Don't move, don't speak, do not destroy your life." The lead seller stepped forward with a reverent posture. "If Your Excellency has no further questions, we may proceed with signatures." It wasn't a suggestion, it was choreography. An advisor slid a leather-bound folder closer to the sheikh. Another verified page numbers. The maitre d' stood near the wall, almost as pale as the vellum they had been admiring, praying for quiet. Mara's eyes drifted back to the projected page. Just a glance, one last stolen look she wished she hadn't taken. And there it was, a fourth anomaly. So small it barely existed. A margin correction mark, one that didn't match the scribe's hand. Corrections in genuine manuscripts were messy, tentative, rushed. This one was symmetrical, clean, intentionally neat, like someone who feared being caught making a mistake. Her throat tightened. If that mark was truly modern, then the manuscript wasn't merely misdated. It was worthless. Not $300, not 3 years, not even $30,000. The sheikh would lose everything on paper, and the scandal would stain him far beyond money. She felt every invisible thread tying her to the life she'd built. Thin, fragile threads. The unstable job, the debt, the visa clock counting down. She couldn't afford attention. She couldn't afford heroism. She couldn't afford the fallout of being the person who ruined a $300 ceremony. But she also couldn't unsee the truth. The sellers exchanged glances, the subtle, anticipatory kind. They were moments from triumph. In their eyes she saw it. The expectation of victory, the relief of profit, the greedy calm of men who believed they had engineered a flawless illusion. And the sheikh, steady, unshakable, inches from writing his name across a masterpiece that wasn't real. Mara felt her breath falter. Her mind whispered the question she feared most. If I don't speak, who will? The pen touched the page, just barely, a soft click against parchment. Her heart surged. Sometimes the universe narrows to a single instant, waiting for one ordinary person to decide whether to keep quiet or change everything. The pen lingered at the edge of the signature line, a metallic promise trembling above disaster. Mara felt the room constrict around her like a fist, every breath contained, every gaze fixed on the sheikh, as if his stillness were a form of worship. Her skin prickled. She hadn't meant to stare again at the screen, but the image pulled her like gravity. The margin correction mark, so delicate, so pretentiously neat, wouldn't let her look away. Her fingers curled behind her back. She told herself, Don't do it. Stay silent." But silence had become unbearable. Her voice rose before she fully understood she was speaking. "Excuse me?" 2 words. Small, polite. But they detonated inside the sealed suite. The advisor closest to her jerked his head in disbelief. The maître d's breath vanished. The seller's eyes snapped toward her, their expressions first confused, then alarmed. The sheikh did not move. He slowly lifted his gaze from the contract, his eyes narrowing with the cold interest of a predator, deciding whether to acknowledge prey. Mara felt the temperature of the room collapse, her spine locked, her pulse hammered against her eardrums. She should have stopped, but the truth was already pushing through her fear. She spoke again, quietly, steadily. The correction mark on slide 27 may not belong to the manuscript's period. Absolute stillness. The sellers exchanged looks, first dismissive, then tight, then angry. One stepped forward, his voice sharpened with condescension. "With respect, young lady, these observations require specialized training." He smiled thinly. "This is a 15th century folio. Those marks are entirely consistent." Mara tried to swallow, but her throat was sand dry. "They're consistent," she answered softly, with someone trying to appear authentic. A low murmur rippled among the advisors. The sheikh leaned back slowly, studying her with unreadable patience. His fingers tapped once, barely a sound, more an indication that he was now listening. "Mara," the maitre d' whispered hoarsely behind her. "Stop, please." But she couldn't. Every slide she remembered layered itself in her mind like a forensic palimpsest. The ink density in the marginalia doesn't match the main text. The ruling lines are too precise, mechanically straight. And the angle notation wasn't used in Andalusia until centuries later. Her words came out fragile, but precise, each one cutting into the exhibition of certainty the sellers had crafted. One of the experts barked a defensive laugh. "That's absurd. The vellum has been carbon dated." She met his stare, voice barely above a breath. "Vellum can be old. Ink can be new." A simple sentence, a devastating truth. The room absorbed it like an impact. The sheikh finally placed the pen down, quietly, but with the authority of a halted verdict. Mara's knees trembled beneath her uniform, but she held her posture. One anomaly could be dismissed, but she had named 3. The first fracture had just split the room in half. Sometimes the risk of speaking becomes smaller than the cost of letting a lie become permanent. The sheikh's pen rested motionless beside the contract, a still object but radiating tension like metal pulled too close to flame. Every person in the room waited for his reaction, as if their livelihoods hinged on the angle of his next breath. Mara felt heat rush to her face, but her voice, fragile as glass, held its shape. One of the seller's experts stepped in quickly, tone polished but cracking at the edges. "Your Excellency, we cannot allow a waitress." The sheikh raised a single finger. Silence slammed back into the suite. He turned his gaze to Mara, the weight of it almost unbearable. It wasn't anger, it wasn't curiosity. It was evaluation, clinical, silent, exacting. The same look he gave assets before, deciding whether to acquire or dismantle them. "Speak," he said. It was not permission. It was a test. Her breath shook as she gathered words she had never expected to use again in a room like this. "The manuscript may not be from the 15th century, she said. "There are inconsistencies, technical ones." An advisor scoffed under his breath, quickly stifled. Another shot Mara a warning glare, panicked that she would cost them their composure. The maitre d' looked ready to faint. The sellers, however, were no longer dismissive. Their faces had sharpened with the alertness of men sensing a threat they thought they had buried deep. The lead expert stepped forward, voice louder this time. "This is absurd. She cannot possibly understand the scientific." Mara cut in without raising her volume. "I can read the marginalia." His mouth closed mid-sentence. "I can read it," she repeated softly. And the handwriting changes. Twice. That struck the room like a slow-moving blow. Handwriting shifts in a manuscript meant only 3 things: a collaborative origin, later additions, or forgery. The sheikh leaned forward at last, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that pinned her to the floor. "What?" he asked, voice low. "Did you see?" The sellers looked ready to intervene, but he lifted his hand again, a gesture that froze them mid-step. Mara inhaled. She pointed with deliberate calm to the projected page. "Here. The correction mark. The ink sits on the vellum instead of seeping into it. Old ink spreads microscopically over centuries. New ink stays clean." A murmur rippled across the advisors, impossible to contain now. "And here," she continued, "the ruling grooves. They're too straight because they weren't carved by hand. Someone used a modern guide." The sellers shifted uncomfortably. "And the angle notation—" She hesitated, but only for a moment. It didn't exist when this manuscript was supposedly written. The sheikh didn't blink. The room trembled with a new kind of silence, one she had created unintentionally but could no longer escape. He sat back, the faintest exhale leaving him. "You interrupted a 300 acquisition," he said quietly. "You'd better be right." Her pulse pounded so hard, it hurt. Truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. The moment she stepped into the space between wealth and deception, she crossed a line no one in that room believed she had the right to cross. Some interruptions are not mistakes. They are turning points that reshape everything after them. The sellers regrouped with the precision of men accustomed to recovering control. Their lead expert stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks with unnecessary force, a gesture meant to reassert dominance. "Your Excellency," he began, voice now carefully modulated, "we can demonstrate the manuscript's authenticity through laboratory results. This young woman is misinformed." The sheikh didn't look at him. He looked only at Mara. "Explain," he ordered. Her throat tightened. But when she stepped closer to the screen, something shifted inside her. Fear giving way to a quiet, familiar discipline. The discipline of analysis, of truth, of a mind trained once to dissect ancient texts without mercy. She raised a trembling hand toward the projection. "The vellum is old," she said. "No one disputes that. But vellum can be taken from any damaged medieval manuscript and repurposed." One advisor frowned. "Repurposed?" "In simple terms," she clarified, "you can scrape the original text off an old page and write something new on top of it. A forgery technique. Centuries old, devastatingly effective." She continued, her voice steadying. "Look at the color shift. Here the parchment is slightly lighter in an oval shape. That's where the original text was removed. You can't fully hide abrasion." The sellers exchanged panicked glances. She moved to the next slide. "The gloss on the ink is wrong. True 15th century ink oxidizes and becomes matte. This ink is reflective under direct light." She tapped the screen lightly, the gesture unexpectedly authoritative. "Reflective ink means it dried recently." A soft exhale broke from one of the advisors, a sound of dread. "And here," she added, shifting to the geometric diagram, "notice the angle notation. This symbol didn't appear in Andalusian hydraulic treatises until nearly 3 centuries later." "Aye," the lead expert protested, "that symbol was added by a later scholar." "No," she whispered. "The ink is the same. Same composition. Same age. Whoever wrote this, wrote it all at once. A forgery pretending to have layers of history." The sheikh's jaw tightened, a subtle, dangerous motion. "Continue." She pointed next to the ruling lines, the faint grooves meant to guide handwriting. "These lines are too perfect. Medieval scribes used a bone stylus. Their hands shook. The lines wavered. These were made with a mechanical edge, a tool invented in the 20th century." The room recoiled. Even the seller's confidence faltered now. Their expressions were no longer composed. They were calculating escape routes. Mara lowered her hand. "This manuscript wasn't discovered," she said softly. "It was manufactured." The sheikh leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at the screen as though seeing it for the first time. The truth now stood in the open, clean, precise, undeniable. Forgery. She had dismantled the masterpiece they tried to sell him, piece by piece, until nothing authentic remained except the vellum it was written on. Clarity can strip even the most elaborate illusion bare. The sheikh did not look away from the screen, but something in his posture sharpened, an alertness that sliced through the room like a cold draft. The sellers remained stiff, their smiles evaporated, their confidence bleeding out through the cracks Mara had opened. But the danger wasn't over. Forgery was one disaster. The contract was another. One of the sheikh's advisors, anxious to regain control, flipped hurriedly through the document as if searching for reassurance. "Your Excellency," he murmured, "even if the manuscript requires further verification, the contractual protections—" He stopped. His fingers froze mid-page. Mara felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air. A wrongness coiling through the room like a low-frequency vibration. The advisor's voice, when it returned, was thin. "There's an indemnity clause here." The lead seller stepped forward quickly. Too quickly. "A standard clause, of course. Nothing unusual." The sheikh raised his head, pinning him with a single look. "Explain it," he ordered. The advisor swallowed. "It states the buyer is responsible for validating authenticity after the transfer." He turned another page, face draining of color. "And the seller is not liable for any discrepancies discovered post-sale." Mara felt the impact like a blow. Another advisor leaned in. "This language, this reverses the burden of proof." Plain meaning, if the manuscript was fake, the sheikh would still pay the full 300 bes, even if he proved the forgery. He would lose even if he won. The contract was a trap. A perfect one. Mara stepped closer, almost against her will. "The phrasing," she whispered. "It's deliberate. See these embedded references?" She pointed to the layered subclauses. "This footnote links to a secondary condition, one that waives your right to retroactive valuation." The sheikh's eyes flicked to her. "Explain in simple terms." "If you sign," she said carefully, "you aren't buying a manuscript." She met his gaze, steady despite her shaking ribs. "You're buying the risk of the manuscript." Silence. Heavy. Crushing. A silence filled with the realization that this was not an art sale. It was a financial ambush. The seller's lead expert attempted a smile. "These clauses are standard in acquisitions of uncertain provenance." Mara cut him off, voice low but unwavering. "No, standard clauses protect both sides. This clause protects only you." She turned to the sheikh. "This contract was built to collapse inward. On you." One of the sellers stepped forward, anger rising. "She is a waitress. You cannot possibly—" The sheikh lifted his hand. He didn't look at the seller. He looked at her. Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs, but she didn't look away. Because now the truth was clear. The forgery was the bait, the contract was the weapon, and she was the only person in the room who had seen both. Some traps are not hidden in shadows. They are hidden in footnotes. The lead seller's composure snapped first. A muscle twitched along his jaw, barely visible but unmistakable. The first crack in a carefully rehearsed performance. His partners stiffened beside him, eyes darting across the room, as if calculating how quickly they could reframe the narrative before it spiraled out of their control. But it was already spiraling. The sheikh closed the contract folder slowly, with a kind of deliberate finality that made the air feel heavier. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The gesture alone signaled something monumental. The center of power in the room had shifted, and it had shifted toward Mara. The sellers launched their counterattack with the desperation of men watching a multi-million-dollar scheme crumble. "Your Excellency," the lead expert began, his voice too bright. "Surely you see this is a misunderstanding. The document is genuine. The clause is standard. This young woman is—" "She is correct," the sheikh said quietly. The expert went still. Even the air stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need force. His certainty carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Show me," the sheikh added. The advisor nearest him scrambled to reopen the contract, flipping back to the indemnity clause. Mara saw his hands shaking. The sheikh leaned in, reading every line, every nested condition, every legal snare disguised as industry language. When he finally spoke, his voice was ice. "This is not a contract," he said. "It is a liability transfer." The sellers exchanged panicked looks. "No, Your Excellency, that is not." He lifted a finger, silencing him. Mara felt the rush of adrenaline hit her knees, but she kept her posture rigid. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be the center of this storm. But the truth had already dragged her into the center, and there was no stepping back. The sheikh turned a page. His gaze sharpened. "This footnote," he said, tapping the line, "references a jurisdictional limitation." The sellers froze. Mara stepped forward cautiously. "It means," she said softly, "if you contested the sale, you'd have to do it in the seller's chosen jurisdiction. And that jurisdiction," she paused, her voice tightening, "does not recognize claims based on retrospective authentication." Plain meaning, if he signed, he could never sue them. Not anywhere, not ever. The second seller lost his composure. "This is outrageous. She's twisting technicalities." Another advisor cut him off, furious. "You exploited a loophole to block litigation." The third seller's mask cracked completely, his voice edged with panic. "Your Excellency, we can renegotiate." The sheikh leaned back slowly, hands steepled. "No," he said. "You will explain how long you've been selling forged manuscripts under indemnity shields." The sellers fell silent, fatally, completely silent. In that stillness, the truth hovered like smoke in the air. Their entire scheme was collapsing, and a waitress had done what none of the experts, advisors, or negotiators had managed. She had seen the flaw. She had said it aloud. Sometimes collapse begins with a whisper, and ends with the sound of truth settling in a room unprepared for it. The sellers stood paralyzed, 3 men in immaculate suits, now visibly shrinking inside them. Sweat glistened on foreheads that had arrived dry and confident. The quiet arrogance that once filled their posture had been replaced with something much thinner. Fear. The sheikh didn't shout. He didn't thunder. His anger moved differently, slow, precise, like a blade gliding along a whetstone. "Who drafted this contract?" he asked. No one answered. His gaze sliced through them. "I'll ask once." The lead seller swallowed, his voice trembling despite the effort to steady it. "Our legal team prepared the structure. We were assured it was compliant." "Compliant," the sheikh repeated, tasting the word as if it were poison. "With what?" Again, silence. Not one of the sellers dared to speak. The room pulsed with the tension of men who understood the magnitude of their failure, but even more, the magnitude of the deception they were caught in. An advisor cleared his throat carefully. "Your Excellency, I can contact our valuation partners." "No." The sheikh didn't raise his tone, but the word landed like a slammed door. "We are not validating their lies." His attention shifted to Mara. It was not gentle, not warm, but it held weight. "Come forward," he said. Her breath hitched, the staff stiffened. Even the maître d' looked as if he might collapse. Mara stepped toward the long obsidian table, every footstep measured. She felt 12 eyes watching her, not with admiration, not with resentment, but with something more complex. Disbelief that she, of all people, had become the hinge the room now turned on. "Show me the faults," the sheikh said. Her hands trembled, but when she reached for the projector remote, something in her shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it aligned itself behind a steadier instinct, the instinct to explain what she had lived her whole life studying. She brought up the problematic slide, ruling lines, ink gloss, margin corrections, angle notation. Each anomaly glowed softly in the dimmed lights, her voice threading through the room with quiet precision. "This is not a historic document," she said. "It is a reconstruction. A skilled one, but still a reconstruction." She pointed to a layered section of ink. "Here, the stroke order is wrong. Medieval Andalusian scribes angled the wrist differently. This is a modern hand trying to imitate a style it doesn't fully understand." One of the sellers broke. "This is ridiculous. No waitress could—" His voice died under the weight of the sheikh's stare. "Continue," the sheikh said to her. She did. The room listened. Truly listened. By the time she finished, even the advisors had lost their skepticism. The evidence was too clean, too linear, too damning. Finally, the sheikh leaned back, fingers steepled. "To attempt fraud is one thing," he said quietly. "To do it in my house is another." The sellers flinched. Mara felt cold sweep through her, a realization of what she had just triggered. Some truths demand accountability, even when no one in the room is ready to face what accountability requires. The seller's composure shattered all at once, an unraveling disguised as negotiation. "Your Excellency," the lead seller began, voice trembling now, "allow us to clarify—" "No." The sheikh didn't raise his voice, but the word struck with the force of a verdict. The second seller attempted a desperate pivot. "We can adjust the price, significantly." "It is not for sale," the sheikh replied coolly, "because it is not what you claimed it was." The third seller, younger and panicking, blurted out, "We were misled by our own sources." The sheikh's advisor slammed the contract shut so sharply the sound cracked through the room. "Your team wrote the indemnity clause. Your team hid the jurisdictional trap. Your team orchestrated a forgery." Panic flickered across the sellers' faces like static. They were no longer trying to convince the sheikh. They were trying to survive his silence. And that silence deepened as he slowly turned his attention back to Mara. She felt her breath catch, but forced herself to stand still. Her palms were damp. Her uniform clung to her back. The heat of fear crawled under her skin. But she didn't lower her eyes, not this time. "What else is hidden?" he asked her. The sellers jolted violently. Mara hesitated, but the answer was there, waiting, undeniable. She swallowed. "One clause authorizes a discretionary transfer fee if the manuscript's ownership lineage is contested." A slow blink from the sheikh. "Meaning?" "That if anyone questions the provenance," she said softly, "you pay them an additional fee." The advisor nearest her hissed sharply. "A penalty for their lie?" Another advisor flipped rapidly through the pages, furious now that shock had worn off. "She's right. It's disguised as a lineage stabilization payment, obscured in sub-paragraphs." The sheikh inhaled once, deep, controlled. The kind of breath a man takes when reining in explosive anger. He looked back at the sellers. "You attempted to sell me a forgery and make me pay extra when it was exposed." The sellers didn't answer. They couldn't. The youngest one began to stammer something, an apology, an excuse, anything. But the lead seller grabbed his wrist, silencing him. The sheikh's chair shifted as he stood. The entire room tensed, but he did nothing theatrical. No shouting, no threats. He simply stepped closer to the artifact case on the table, the real manuscript inside, glowing under soft museum-grade lighting. He rested his hand on the glass. "This is worthless," he said. But the attempt was bold. No one breathed. He turned to Mara again, and for the first time, his voice softened by a fraction. Not kindness, but recognition. "You saw what none of my experts did." She felt heat rise in her chest, fear, exhaustion, disbelief. "You stopped a theft," he added. Her knees nearly buckled. Behind her, the staff watched with wide eyes. The advisors watched with newfound respect. The sellers watched with terror. Because the breaking point had arrived, not in a shout, not in a blow, but in the quiet realization that the smallest person in the room had dismantled the largest deception. Some moments do not explode. They fracture, and everything fragile collapses along the fault line. The sellers stood cornered, back straight but spirits collapsing inward. The facade of authority they had worn so confidently now clung to them like ill-fitting armor. Even the lighting made them look smaller, harsh, exposing, unforgiving. The sheikh remained standing beside the display case, his profile carved in chilled focus. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of his silence was punishment enough. "Tell me," he said, still facing the manuscript rather than the men who tried to deceive him. "How many of these forgeries you've circulated?" The lead seller finally broke, his voice frayed, stripped of polish. We don't handle the production. We only broker the sales." The sheikh turned slightly, not fully. Just enough that the partial movement felt like a blade turning toward its target. "You're telling me you knowingly brokered forged manuscripts?" The younger seller buckled. "We were told authenticity was confirmed." Mara stepped forward before she could stop herself. No one who understands medieval ink could have believed that confirmation. Her voice was soft, but it sliced through their excuses like cold steel. The sellers stared at her with a new emotion, not condescension, not irritation. Fear. She realized it too late. Once again, she had stepped into territory where she did not belong. Territory with consequences she couldn't predict. An advisor closed the contract folder with reverent care, as if sealing away a poisonous artifact. "Your Excellency," he said, turning to the sheikh, "we can take legal action. This constitutes fraud with deliberate financial entrapment." The sellers stiffened violently. The sheikh didn't look at them. "Leave the room." They hesitated, fatally, and he turned fully at last, his expression colder than the suite's engineered chill. "I said," he repeated, "leave." And they obeyed. Fast. Silent. Shaken. The doors shut behind them with a hydraulic whisper that felt like a sentence being carried out. For a moment, no one moved. The advisors hovered in charged silence. The staff stood paralyzed. The maitre d' clutched the service towel like a lifeline. The manuscript glowed on the table, exposed now as the fragile lie that had nearly cost the sheikh hundreds of millions. Mara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She had spoken too much. She had stepped too far. She had crossed lines that people in her position were not allowed to cross. She waited for the fallout, the reprimand, the dismissal, the subtle gesture toward the door meaning "thank you for saving the sheikh's fortune," now disappear. Instead, he turned toward her. Not with warmth, not with gratitude, but with interest, the kind of interest that rewrites the hierarchy of a room. "You have changed the course of this negotiation," he said quietly, "and possibly the course of something larger." Her breath trembled. Something inside her, something long buried under debts, fear, and invisibility, stirred for the first time in years. Because she realized the truth, the scheme had collapsed, but something else had opened. When a lie falls apart, it often drags the past with it, and reveals a future no one expected. The silence that followed the seller's exit was unlike any that had filled the suite before. Not tense, not fearful, but suspended, as if the room itself was adjusting to a new gravitational center. The sheikh remained standing, contemplative, one hand resting lightly on the glass of the manuscript case. The advisors waited, poised between protocol and uncertainty. The staff stood rooted to their spots, afraid to breathe. And Mara. She tried to make herself small again, invisible again. But invisibility had shattered the moment she opened her mouth. She clasped her hands behind her back, lowering her eyes, willing her heartbeat to steady. She had spoken truth to protect a man who had shown her no kindness. She had exposed a fraud no one else had seen. And now she stood before him, utterly unsure whether she had saved herself or doomed herself. The sheikh finally turned to her fully. "You," he said, not unkindly, but with a weight that pressed against her ribs, "are not what you appear to be." She froze. "I hire experts across 3 continents," he continued, "conservators, philologists, analysts. Yet none of them caught what you caught in minutes." She didn't answer. She couldn't. He stepped closer. Not invading her space, not intimidating. Just closing the distance like a man examining an unexpected variable. "Where did you learn classical Arabic?" he asked. Her voice was a whisper. "University. Before I left." "Why did you leave?" She hesitated, her throat tightening. "I couldn't afford to stay." The sheikh studied her a long moment. A micro-expression, almost imperceptible, flickered across his face. Not sympathy, recognition. He knew the shape of struggle. He knew the taste of having to fight for every inch of ground. "What is your name?" he asked. "Mara Solis." Her name sounded too small in the chilled suite, too fragile, too out of place. He nodded once, thoughtfully. "Mara," he repeated, as if fitting it into the architecture of the room. Then he turned to his advisors. "I want a full forensic review of every acquisition from this firm. Quietly." His tone darkened. "If they have sold forged artifacts to any other collector, I want to know before it becomes public." The advisors bowed their heads. "Yes, Your Excellency." He faced Mara again. "You prevented a significant loss. But more than that," he paused, measuring his words, "you saw through a deception crafted specifically to fool people far more experienced than you." She swallowed hard. "I only told the truth. And that," he said, "is rare in rooms like this." Her breath caught, because it was the closest thing to praise he had ever given anyone in her presence. Still, she knew better than to assume safety. Praise did not mean protection. Recognition did not mean acceptance. But for the first time, she felt the axis of the evening tilt. Power had moved, not completely, not securely, but unmistakably. Sometimes power doesn't shift with a roar, but with a single sentence spoken by someone no one thought mattered. The sheikh took a step back from her, not retreating but reassessing, as though recalibrating the internal map he used to categorize people. She was no longer in the staff column, no longer an invisible figure in a black vest. She was standing somewhere he hadn't anticipated, and he was adjusting the coordinates. "Mara Solis," he said again, testing the sound of it in the chilled air. "You do not belong on the service line." She felt heat rush to her face. I'm just trying to keep my job, Your Excellency." "You kept far more than your job tonight." His gaze sharpened. "You kept me from signing a disaster." Behind him, the advisors exchanged subtle looks, quiet, startled acknowledgments that something unusual was happening. The staff watched with a kind of stunned reverence, their fear temporarily eclipsed by awe. The sheikh motioned toward the manuscript case. "You understood this work in a way no one else here did. You saw intentions, not accidents, patterns, not coincidences." Her chest tightened. "That's just training," she whispered. "Old training." He shook his head slowly. "No, many people have training, few have instinct." She didn't know what to do with his words. They felt too large for her, too heavy, as if he were handing her something she wasn't sure she deserved. He looked at his advisors. Prepare a report and contact the Institute of Forensic Philology. Several heads snapped upward. One advisor cleared his throat. Your Excellency, you mean to consult with them? No, he said. I mean to place her there. The room stopped breathing. Mara stared at him, stunned. I don't understand. The sheikh regarded her calmly. You belong in a place where manuscripts are examined, not served on trays. Her pulse hammered. Your ability is wasted here, he continued. At the Institute, you will have access to archives, laboratories, specialists. They will know what to do with someone who sees the world through ink. Her lips parted, but no words came out. This couldn't be real. Not for someone like her. Not after years of being invisible, disposable, precarious. I'm not qualified, she whispered finally. I haven't finished my studies. I don't have the credentials. You have what matters, he interrupted. Proof of mind, proof of precision, proof of truth. Her throat tightened painfully. The chef de salle took a tiny step back, as if giving her space to breathe. Even the maitre d' seemed on the verge of tears. The good kind, the kind that came from witnessing something impossible. The sheikh added in a lower, steadier voice, If you accept, I will sponsor your placement. Training, stipend, housing, handled. You will not have to choose between survival and knowledge again. Her vision blurred for a moment, not from fear, from relief so foreign it felt dangerous. Why? She whispered. He studied her with cold clarity, but his words held something gentler beneath them. Because someone who can dismantle a 300 nometers deception in under an hour, he said, should not be serving water. A truth settled inside her, trembling but undeniable. Sometimes the world finally sees you, not when you rise, but when you refuse to disappear. The Institute's archive smelled of dust, vellum and possibility, a scent Mara had once believed belonged to a life she would never touch again. Now she unlocked that door every morning with her own access card. 1 year had reshaped her completely. Her debts were gone. Her visa was stable. Her hands no longer trembled when she handled fragile manuscripts. They moved with purpose, confidence, belonging. The stipend the sheikh had arranged allowed her to live without fear. The training refined instincts she had once hidden under a waitress's uniform. And for the first time in years, she woke without the weight of invisibility pressing against her ribs. On her desk sat a new assignment, a manuscript with disputed lineage. The director had written only one sentence in the margin. I trust your eye. She smiled, small, private, real. The world outside remained loud, fragile, unpredictable. But inside these walls, she had built something steady, a place where precision mattered, where her mind mattered, where the smallest details she saw were not nuisances, but gifts. She hadn't become powerful. She had simply stopped being erased. And that, she knew now, was enough. If you want more stories like this one, share it, like it, and stay for the next tale waiting in the ink.